Florida State has some good news on the Zahir Mathis front and might be the leader, but the Noles are not quite out of the woods yet.
You are Locked On Seminoles, your daily podcast on the Florida State Seminoles. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into Locked On Seminoles. I am your host, Brian Smith, longtime college football recruiting analyst and writer. Thank you for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day. I truly appreciate you stopping in to talk some Noles with me. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head over to FanDuel.com to get started. Today's show is going to wrap up with some overview of what's going on with the portal, what Florida State needs to do next, and my grades for everything now that I've kind of looked at what they have compared to several other programs. But before we get to that, we got quite a bit of recruiting to get into, including some 26 news. But we start with Zahir Mathis, the defensive end that visited Florida State earlier this month. The class of 2025 prospect out of Emotep Charter in Philadelphia is one of the most coveted pass rushers in the entire country. He has canceled, this is surprising to me, the visit to Michigan, and I have not, at least to date, have not heard anything about him rescheduling. What's going on with that? I don't know why. The UCLA visit didn't happen because of the wildfires. That's a complete disaster out there, and that's unfortunate. I hope anybody that's listening to this, everybody that they know in that area is safe. But there are still a couple of things in the way for Florida State getting Mathis. Number one, Maryland is involved. They're going to get a visit this coming weekend. Number two, and this is the newer development, and I really don't know what to think about it, just have some initial thoughts, but Virginia Tech hired a defense coordinator, and he's going to do an in-home with Mathis. I'm not really sure where they stand, how long they've had a relationship with him, if Mathis or anybody in his camp knows much about the new coach, how much they know about the staff. This is one of those curveballs in recruiting that even somebody like me that's got a ton of experience, you're like, we'll just see what happens. I'm not sure that Florida State shouldn't be considered the leader or the most likely landing spot, however you want to put it. But Virginia Tech gives me pause because, I know flat out that NIL is a big part of this. I know nothing about Virginia Tech's NIL. And before you ask, Maryland's got serious NIL, big time. So their offer will be very competitive, if not even better than Florida State's from what I know. Just as an FYI, the guy who runs Under Armour, he happens to be a Maryland grad. They've got plenty of money if they want to go after somebody. And they've already got Ely, arguably the best player in the country for that matter, a kid from Maryland who's a pass rusher in the 26 class committed, and his NIL package that I've been told is ridiculous. So Florida State will have to battle that. But the Virginia Tech part, again, I don't know much about that scenario, why he's entertaining Virginia Tech and how much they're involved. But here are a couple of things that I do know. Florida State has been after him for a long time. This isn't like they're the newcomer, the Johnny-come-lately in Zahir Mathis's recruitment. Two, if you look at the players that are in this recruitment, Florida State historically is by and large way better than the other two. I'm not picking on them. And again, maybe Michigan gets back involved, but it doesn't sound like it. If that's the case, that favors the Florida State Seminoles. Finally, let's be honest. Coach White, Pot Roast, and the defensive staff, they've shown what they can do with guys with this kind of length, running their style of defense. It's a pretty straightforward pitch here. Mathis is a great fit. The spot that James Williams, the transfer from Nebraska, would play this coming season is the same one I would expect Mathis to play. An outside linebacker / stand-up defensive end, and it's got a million different terms. I'm sure Florida State will have a name for it too. That position, what I like to call the Lawrence Taylor position from back in the days when I used to watch the NFL when I was a kid, is very difficult. It is as much, if not more than any other position about measurables. You've got to have elite length and quickness to play that spot at a high level. Zahir Mathis, I've stood next to the kid. He's conservatively 6'5". and he's 225, 230, and can really run. I saw him at the Under Armour game. I've seen him in practices, just watching him, just how he moves laterally and everything. He fits the bill. It shouldn't be hard, to be quite frank, for Florida State to sell what they have to Mathis. To that point, I'm curious to see what else happens between now and the end of this weekend. If there's any other new news, it's been a little surprising, again, that Michigan's not in it, but signing day is coming up next week, the traditional signing day. It's always the first Wednesday in February. So I would assume that Mathis is going to wrap this up pretty quick. We should get some kind of finalization of what's happening, who's going to be the final two. I don't know if there's any reason to believe that Florida State, again, is not the team to beat, but this is an unusual scenario. We'll see if anybody else comes back in it, but overall, I like Florida State, and no offense to Virginia Tech or Maryland, they don't have the same cachet. So let's see if the only thing else they might have is a little closer, but in today's world, I just don't think that holds as much water as it once did. And Florida State's got kids from across the country on their roster now and have for years, so I don't think that's going to matter much. Also on the recruiting front, while we're talking about it, a few things on the class of 2026. Number one, and this is something that drives me nuts, and it's all over the map on why this happens, but a kid that I've talked about quite a bit on this show already for 26, one of the most important recruits on the board, in my opinion. Florida State's gone after him. They've offered him. They've been recruiting him for a while. Singleton, the running back at FSU, same high school, Fleming Island. Jarius Rogers has committed to Syracuse. Syracuse, a kid from Jacksonville. They've actually got 3 kids from the Sunshine State committed already. That's impressive for Fran Brown and his staff, but let me be clear. It's one thing to lose them to the Gators, the Dogs, Clemson Tigers, LSU Tigers, Notre Dame, Michigan. You cannot lose North Florida kids to Syracuse. Period. I have sung the praises of the new staff. I have talked about how much they've done a good job, and they have. Under no circumstance can Florida State, if they're truly targeting this kid, can they lose players to Syracuse? Call it whatever you want. I call that a massive failure. Now, it's early in the process, and he's still going to take visits, I'm sure, because that's just what Florida kids do. But that is a red flag to me. Now, again, Fran and his staff do a tremendous job at Syracuse, but it's still Syracuse. Florida State cannot lose those battles. Just want to bring that up. Next, Florida State is trying to make not just inroads in South Florida, they're going big game hunting. Jordan Campbell is at Carroll City, tradition-rich program for those of you not familiar, one of the top programs in South Florida for a long, long time. And to be honest with you, it's not shocking that he's committed to the Miami Hurricanes. Well, 4 of Florida State's coaches just stopped by to visit with him. And just kind of looking at the overview of what's going on in South Florida, Cooper and several other guys in South Florida that the Noles have recruited, Derek Cooper, by the way, not Evan Cooper, the coach. These guys are really good football players they're going after, and they're really trying to make inroads. And maybe I'm missing something, but I think Florida State is further ahead in underclassmen / the rising senior group at this point than at any other time during Mike Norvell's tenure as the Florida State football head coach. It's about time. Part of that's the staff. Part of that, I'm guessing, is the administration telling him, you need to up the ante here on the high school trail. We can't be a portal team forever, especially after the 24 season. That's just my guess. I have no intel on that. That's just my guess. But regardless of why, it's happening. Florida State is making not just overtures, here's an offer, this and that. Their junior days have done well. They've had a bunch of guys on campus that are good, that have given, quite honestly, a ton of good feedback. And most importantly, there's been consistent communication based on all the information that's come out. I don't care which network you go through or anybody that I've spoken with directly, a 7-on-7 coach, whatever it is, Florida State has just done better. I think that a lot of us were right, that the prior staff, I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of specifics here, but some of the guys on the prior staff just weren't very good recruiters. I had heard that a number of times from other people in the industry. Quite honestly, people that are closer to Florida State than I am, that's not a good sign. But many of those guys are gone. With that being stated, now you're in a scenario where Florida State is starting to make inroads. And let me be very clear. It's one thing to have Surtain down there, which is about as good an ace up your sleeve that you can have. Elite NFL player, coached at American Heritage, has done well as a DB coach at Florida State, still has ties to Broward, Dade, etc. That's always going to help. Do not discount Evan Cooper, the coach that's coming over from Nebraska to be at Florida State. He's another guy. He played in the public league in South Florida. He knows the 7-on coaches. He knows some of the coaches in South Florida on a personal level by now because he's just recruited it and he grew up there. Florida State is going to do much better in South Florida, I think, moving forward, and it's already kind of showing up. I'm not saying they're going to whitewash Miami or Florida or anybody else. That's not what I'm saying, but they will end up at the end of this cycle, as long as they're on this continued path, with 1 or 2 more players in South Florida than they would normally get. And that could be a really big dividend for the Noles. When we come back, we're going to talk a little more recruiting and then get into some transfer portal information. That's next here on Locked on Seminoles. Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. Live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel like the thrill of kickoff all the way through the final minute is just awesome. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app and head over to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet $5, and if you win, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of the Super Bowl 59. As Florida State navigates the class of 25 finish and gets started in 2026, there's still a few more things to talk about here. Number one, I've noticed a trend. As I mentioned a little bit ago about Zahir Mathis, Florida State's recruited nationally for a long time, and they've always gotten a kid from Texas or a California kid, a Jersey kid, etc. Right before I started finishing up my notes for this show, I saw that Florida State offered a defensive lineman in New Jersey. I didn't dig into it, but I'm like, this kind of fits. Pot Roast is from the Northeast originally himself, and he's coached up in that area before, so not surprising. To that end, I've also seen recent offers in Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. They're going out across the country. They're looking at a tight end from the Midwest. They are not going to just be beholden to Georgia and Florida, etc. Now, that's always going to be the bread and butter for the Noles, but it's interesting that they're doing this. Why do I think that it's going to be important? Because I think if you stay in on kids, it has two big benefits. Number one, you can always get the kid out of high school, obviously. But teams that, we're going to have to work too hard for this guy. I don't want to do this, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to mess with the NIL. Well, those are also the guys that not only do you miss on the recruitment, but down the road, you're in a very difficult spot because you're also going to miss out on the opportunity for the kids that go into the portal. Relationships. We've talked about it forever right here on Locked on Seminoles. If you are not ready to build a relationship with a kid, even though you may not think you're going to get him, and a great example, again, is Mathis. Florida State was never considered the favorite, but they stayed involved, stayed in touch with people, etc. It's probably going to work out for Florida State, barring another major shift. That's why you stick with it. Everybody said it was going to be Michigan, then that visit didn't take place. Stick with your guns, promote who you are, sell you as a person, be original, do not lie to the kid. If you do these things, long-term, you will be just fine. Florida State, to be honest, under Bowden, they might have been the most consistent in that area. They didn't really hide what they were doing. Very faith-based. If you're not, it may not be the place for you. The offenses and defenses kind of spoke for themselves, and they were pretty point blank about how they coached. And Bobby allowed his position coaches to have a little more free will on what they did than most guys. That was the pitch. Family, faith, football. It's going to be a little more assistant coach. I'm the head guy, but my assistants are the reason they stay with me because I let them coach. Do you want to come? We're going to win, by the way. We're going to win 10 or more games this year and the next year and the next year. They were consistent. In a way, I think that's kind of what Florida State needs to do moving forward, and maybe they're leaning that direction. I'm not saying they're going to go on a Bowden recruiting run, top 4 class every single year. By no stretch do I think that. But at the same time, you're not going to maximize who you are and what you can do unless you start doing things that are a little bit more consistent on the recruiting trail. And I've seen that. And getting out on kids in Mississippi, Texas, and other places, you got to do it. And Florida State has put in the effort. I have slapped Norvell around in regards to the recruiting commentary for a long time, since I started the show in August of 23. He's not been a very good recruiter. As far as elite programs go, he hasn't. The attitude is just totally different. Who, what, when, where, and why. Again, I gave my thoughts on that a minute ago, but everybody can speculate on it. But he's been on the trail himself as well, and the staff is doing better. If you're a Florida State fan today, know that more effort is being put in from everything that I can see than it has been in a long time. That's always a positive. Now, I'm going to wrap that up on recruiting, and I want to transition into the portal. And it's a similar thing right now. Florida State didn't get an A grade for me from the portal. I'll get my grade in just a moment. But they've done a pretty good job. And the number one thing that I noticed when I started looking at Florida State's haul compared to where everybody else is at, now that we're back to the second signing day, I figured it's time for this. What grade did they deserve? Where are they? What did they miss on, etc.? All those kind of things. I think overall it's a B grade, but it's still, you got to remember now, this is not a finished product. In case you did not know, there is a second transfer portal window that Florida State and every school gets after the spring practice session is complete. I believe it's late April to early May, whatever the date. It's a 10-day window to enter your name. You don't have to complete everything and do your paperwork to transfer to Florida State or wherever, or vice versa, but to put your name in. Anyway, Florida State, they did a pretty good job in terms of getting to the point where they can be a little more selective for the spring portal window. And of course, after the spring window, you'll have a few different things that take place during spring ball. Oh, we need a little more help here. We're a little better there. There'll be some guys leave, etc. It's just part of the nuances of college athletics in today's world, especially with NIL. But I think Florida State's a little bit ahead of what I thought. I kind of looked over just roughly. I'm not going to go in player for player today, but like Miami, Florida, and some other schools. And to be honest, while I don't think Florida State did an elite job because they didn't spend all their money, I can't sit there and say the number one concern here for me was, did we do enough on the O-line? They already got 4 guys. All 4 of them was starting experience. These aren't just guys that have, well, maybe he's going to be okay, blah, blah, blah. He was highly recruited. These are 4 players that have started. So with that, I'm just going to kind of throw this out here. You got Gunnar Hansen, who I think I'm going to bring that name up here again in a minute. Very important. I think he'll be the left tackle. That's my guess. He's played it before. You got Micah Pettis. By the way, Hansen played at Vandy. Pettis played right tackle at Ole Miss. You got Adrian Medley played guard at UCF. And then you got Luke Pettibone was a center for Wake. All starters. That's important, man. When you had such a sieve up front and the revolving door, the injuries did not help. But when you had such a revolving door like that, it's impressive that Florida State got 4 guys pretty quick. I've been around Coach Hand. He's a great dude. I'm not shocked that they went out and they got some good players. But to get 4 like that quickly, hats off to him. And quite honestly, everybody, once again, general manager, to the people in the back office, the recruiting room, the whole 9 yards. Everybody does their role to make that happen. They did a pretty good job. When I come back to finish up the show, we're going to talk about a couple of different questions I have for the portal, where else they did well, and where I think they still need to hit a home run to finish out the portal class in the spring. That is next here on Locked on Seminoles. Where else I think Florida State did pretty darn well is the defensive line. I know many Noles fans that comment on the Locked on Seminoles YouTube page, And thank you once again for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple, whatever place you get it to download and listen or to watch. The people that are commenting about the portal, they were worried going into it about the D-line. Not as much as O-line, I'll grant you that, but D-line was brought up a lot. They got 4 guys there too. Talking about balance, filling needs. Deontay McCray, Jason Jenkins, Diamante Diggs, and then the guy that I think is really, really important, man, James Williams from Nebraska, the outside linebacker, that Lawrence Taylor position. He could play maybe strong side end if you needed him to situationally, but whatever the case may be, I think Williams is really important. So you got McCray. He's a kid that came out of Western Kentucky that was really good. You got Demonte Diggs, came out of Coastal. You got Jason Jenkins, played at Tennessee. And then you got a kid who played in Nebraska. All of them have valuable experience. Again, they went for guys that had proven success opposed to last year. That's part of the reason I think the balance is good. There are a couple of kids that didn't play quite as much. Lavalley, he's a kid that's a linebacker they were recruited, but he only went to North Carolina for a year. So we really don't know. But D-line is in a much better space. Florida State needed to get better up front on each side of the football, and they did it. And they did it quite honestly by being smart. They didn't just go by rankings. They did their due diligence. Raise your hand if a year ago you wouldn't have been excited about Florida State getting a kid out of Vanderbilt to play left tackle. I'd have raised my hand real quick if I was on that side of the ledger being asked that question. I saw the kid play live last year. I saw him play against Auburn. He's a pretty good player. Auburn's got some pretty good defensive ends, and he did a pretty good job that day, and they beat Auburn. That's why you do your due diligence. There's nothing like watching the film and seeing what happens. I highly doubt if he was at Vanderbilt that he was a 4 or 5 star recruit coming out of high school. Okay, I don't know who Gunnar Hansen was coming out of high school, but he figured it out in college. Florida State went and got him, and he's probably going to be their tackle. That's just one example. But again, McCray and some of these other guys, like, they were overlooked too. Florida State is doing their due diligence, and to be honest with you, I think it's awesome. That's very important. As for my concerns here, the only thing that I'm really curious about is, can they get another star in the spring window? Here's what I mean. There's no doubt in my mind, it's pure talent. Deuce Robinson is the guy. He will have a big year this upcoming season, and he'll probably turn pro. That's fine. Can Florida State get at least one more, if not 2, in the portal? And it doesn't have to be based on name recognition. Again, do your own due diligence. You got the center out of Wake Forest. He's not going to get a ton of credit, but that was a pretty good offense with limited talent. Let's not kid ourselves. Over much of the tenure that he was there. That's a good sign. Further, Florida State just needs a little bit more skill talent. I still wouldn't be shocked if they took some kind of defensive back, maybe a guy that can be some kind of a nickel safety guy, because they run 3 safeties in this defense under Coach White. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with that. And don't forget about a guy like Squirrel White. He's can play inside in the slot, outside, etc. on the offensive side. But can you complement him with one more receiver or running back, or maybe a guy that can play a little of both, kind of like a Jalen Lucas, just to keep adding? Maybe it's a player also that, like Lucas, could be a special teams guy. Possible. Doesn't mean that he's going to be rated elite, but it can lead to victories on the field this fall. As I talked about Florida State's schedule on yesterday's show, it's manageable, but adding 1 or 2 maybe big-time players for how you run your schemes, the fit that you have for your program socially, off the field, faith, the whole 9 yards. There are different ways to grade home runs, and I still think Florida State can elevate its transfer portal class with just a few more players. Sure, I'd like another Deuce Robinson, don't get me wrong. But I don't think there's as many of those kind of guys in the portal because more teams spent money to keep their guys in-house this year than they did last. That's one thing in the house settlement and all that. I think a lot of people are really spending money right now. So we'll see what else is added. A question for you. Do you think Thomas Castellanos can be a star, and why? I think he can be, but I'm really curious to see how much he's not only able to pick up the offense again. He's played in it before. He was at UCF with Gus, but help other guys. Another question. James Williams. I think that he does need a star, or needs to be a star. Do you believe he will be? Remember now, When he was at Nebraska, he was pretty much a designated pass rusher and was a guy off the bench. He wasn't the key starter, but he still played over 200 reps. So he got a lot of playing time. We'll see how that goes. And finally, one last question here to wrap up the show. I've mentioned Gunnar Hansen. Will he be the surprise star among the O-line? Because again, he played at Vanderbilt. He's going to fly under the radar. I think he's a pretty good player. If you have not seen him play, I think you're going to like him. If you get a chance, check out some of his highlights. That's a good football player. But with that, thank you once again for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day. I truly appreciate you stopping in to talk some Noles with me. If you would, hit that like button, that notification bell, and subscribe to the Locked On Seminoles podcast and share it with other Florida State fans. I'd love to get in front of them so they can join the community. Everybody have a good one. I will talk to you again soon.